Hello, I'm Jason Bounds from UMass Boston, here to talk to you today about asymmetric information in the law enforcement context and how that impacts law enforcement efficiency. Let's jump right into it and make sure we all have a solid foundation and common ground of what terms mean. Um, Goods and services actually have a wide array of interpretations in defining what exactly those mean. For purposes of this talk, we're going to refer to services as intangible goods and the traditional notion of goods, which you would think of as products, material things, as tangible goods. And so therefore, services and goods would go under the wider umbrella of goods. And think of it as really an exchange, tradability, we could say, from a provider transferring the tangible or intangible good to a recipient whom we'll refer to as a consumer or customer. Paul Samuelson in 1954 grouped services and goods together and referred to these as outputs, which is, again, framing the idea of a transfer that's happening, and outputs are are at the finish line of that transfer. So two other things to keep in mind is that providers are usually motivated in some way to create this tangible or intangible good and to furnish it for the customer recipient. And in a private goods context, of course, that would be profit, wanting to earn a profit. And then in the public goods context, where resources are certainly a lot more limited, whether they're based on user service fees or tax revenues, they're not limitless like profits in theory could be. So the focus there would be on efficiency and conserving limited public fiscal resources. So it's not making a profit, it's for the public sector and for public goods, profit is really going to be maximizing the public benefit and minimizing the waste. So one other point is there have been theories that all products ultimately are a means to an end, which is receiving a service of some sort. You go to the pharmacy and you pick up medication, and that's serving your interest in having good health. You purchase a firearm, exercising your Second Amendment right, and receiving a service of safety. You go out and buy a car, which is a tangible good, and you're receiving the service of freedom of motion to travel. So that's another way of looking at it, just in framing the relationship between goods and services. We'll just refer to goods and specifically public goods as it comes up as including these tangible and intangible concepts. So how do we define what kind of goods that are on hand? Well, there's a litmus test, and it focuses on two concepts, excludability and rivalry, which we can call rivalrousness. As we look here, we have four categories. Private goods are not public goods, and what makes them private goods is that there's rivalry, there's competition for those particular goods. There could be a scarcity there, or usually is, meaning that it can be used up, and the supply will go down and potentially could diminish. I mean, think of toilet paper during the COVID pandemic. Thermometers to check your temperature. It was impossible in some communities, in some markets, to get a hold of those things. So rivalry, is there rivalry or competition? And if there is, that's one clue for private goods. The other one is excludability. If people can be limited from accessing or acquiring that particular good or output, whether it's tangible or intangible, then that again would make the case that this is a private good. Usually it's financial limitations when we're referring to excludability. On the other hand, club goods are quasi-public because they have some elements of what a public good would be, which we'll be speaking about in a moment, as you see in the chart here. But club goods are when you would have excludability, but when people use it, it does not diminish the supply. So a good instance would be Wi-Fi service, cable TV service, which not everybody can afford, but no matter how many people get it, it's still going to be provided. If 100 people get it, it doesn't mean other people are going to go without. So they are not being pushed out because of rivalry or competition. It's really about being able to access the resource. On the other hand, we have what's referred to as common resources, which would be timber, fisheries, pasture land, which would be freely accessible to everybody. So it's not excludable, but at the same time, there's a rivalry there because it can be used up. And when it's used up to the extreme, it was actually Hardin was a gentleman who came up with this idea of tragedy of the commons, meaning that if everyone can freely access a good or a resource, then ultimately it could be depleted, which means nobody could have it anymore. If you have a forest, which everyone can go into to get timber, eventually that forest is going to be deforested and there won't be any timber left for anybody, all right? The supply would be exhausted. So that, again, is quasi-public, also known as an impure public good, because it has some qualities in being freely accessible to everybody without exclusion. But at the same time, there's that rivalry there, which is an element that's part of private goods. Finally, pure public goods. These are types of intangible or tangible goods which are actually not subjected to any kind of rivalry. And people who access it, it doesn't impact the overall supply or availability of it. If you have a fire and the fire department comes and puts the fire out, hopefully, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to go put out other fires, right? So that would be something we could think of as a public good. It's non-exclusable, at least in theory. It's non-excludable, where the fire department can't say, "Oh, I don't want to go to that house. I don't want to go to that street. Oh, I don't like those people, so we're not going to go there." Or, "Hey, they don't have money to pay us, so we're just going to let their house burn down." That's not something that happens. So that's what would make something a pure public good, non-excludable, and something that's not subjected to rivalry to the point where the supply would diminish the more people that tap into it. So this kind of just frames what a public good is and contrasts it with private goods and quasi-public goods. Also keep in mind that as technology changes and geography changes and environmental conditions change, that you could have private goods becoming public goods, or public goods turning into common resources if the supply somehow gets impacted. So there's a lot of flux that can go on here across time, but that's something for another day. For now, just keep in mind public goods, non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So now we have asymmetric information. Before we apply this to the law enforcement context and think about public goods, asymmetric information is really a situation where parties that are entering into an exchange, a provider and a recipient or customer, have some inequality in terms of the information they have about that transaction or exchange. It was actually a famous paper that came out by Akrylov in the was it in the 1960s? It was quite a while ago. And he framed this in terms of a used car dealership, used car dealers who are selling lemons, which are cars that really aren't in good working condition, but they're keeping this a secret. They're presenting this as perfectly working cars to unknowing buyers. right? So the car dealers are selling it to, and so they're basically, there's an unfair advantage, and they're basically exploiting them, exploiting their trust and their good faith, because they know that these vehicles are not up to par, but still selling them at a price which would suggest that they are in good working order and there's nothing wrong with them. And in that case, there are a number of things which can go wrong, but eventually there can be what's called adverse selection, which is when sellers, with the car dealers, of course, end up being disadvantaged because the buyers, because they've lost trust, they no longer want to buy these cars. It's not worth the risk for them. So what happens is market failure in the extreme case, where whereas the car dealers in the short term are profiting, perhaps from basically the fraud and the exploitation that's going on, but in the long term, the sellers are moving away from the market to the extent that they don't even want to risk buying a car, and including the ones that actually aren't lemons. So it's not a good situation. It's inefficient, and we'll see on the next slide here how dangerous that really is. Just keep in mind that asymmetric information is different from imperfect information, which is really where both parties are lacking in being fully informed about all the information that would help to inform their transaction. So imperfect information, the disparity, it doesn't necessarily create an unfair advantage, but asymmetric information, that's where the real concern is. And again, George Akerlof's the one who wrote that landmark paper that really laid a foundation for defining this concept as time went on. So number of problems here. Here's adverse selection, which can lead to market failure. You have moral hazard, where an incentive that's created, for example, if insurance is offered, or even seatbelts, which are intended to keep people safe or to better people, actually makes people feel more emboldened to engage in risky behaviors, right? So somebody who has a seatbelt might think, oh, I can speed now, I'll be safe, or I have airbags, I'll be safe, oh, I have insurance, so I can just smoke, and if I get cancer, I can get treatment because I have insurance now. So this would be a case of moral hazard, meaning there's really an unintended consequence that's going on, and ultimately you don't know if you have if someone's smoking or not. They could not be following doctor's orders. On the other hand, you could have doctors who are overbilling and recommending that patients get procedures that they might not need. And the insurance, which is supposed to help people access medical care, is actually facilitating doctors taking advantage of the system. So also we have monopolies of knowledge, which is where you have organizations where upper management, for example, is withholding information, or even if you have different groups where some groups are keeping information away from others, and in that case, you'd have disparities locked in across time. And in the law enforcement context, this can apply because it can create inefficiency, where upper management isn't sharing information with people on the front lines, or even across different law enforcement agencies, like what happened with 9/11, right? The FBI and some federal law enforcement had information which ultimately wasn't shared, and that was one of the concerns of the 9/11 Commission, that there were intelligence failures. And just some other general public policy arguments: that it facilitates fraud, asymmetric information is unethical, just on principle, it's just not right. Market failures, we'd already mentioned that with, for example, adverse selection. It creates distrust, makes people not want to engage with the market at all, or with providers, and just against public policy. Again, it's just not right. So law enforcement, these involves agencies and employees who enforce laws, maintain public order, public safety. They have tremendous power. They can investigate, detain individuals, restrict their freedom, and detain them if they're convicted for criminal offenses, especially when you're referring to sheriff's departments. So there are some debates out there about whether or not law enforcement is a pure public good, because especially in modern times with new data, new research that's come out, and some findings suggesting selective enforcement of laws that are disparaging particular groups on the basis of race and income and in other areas. And also, if a jurisdiction doesn't have adequate fiscal resources, would that force the agency to have to exclude certain groups or to prioritize their resources? So there are some debates out there that, in fact, law enforcement does have some exclusionary tendencies. This is just a quote from an NYU professor that operates a community project which is trying to seek reform and foster dialogues with the police, specifically in New York City. It's where it's headquartered, but working with law enforcement organizations across the nation. Basically, Professor Friedman points out that police don't have accountability. He says, police, we basically said, keep the peace, solve crime, go forth and do it any way you want. There's a vacuum of regulation that's stunning. Vacuum of regulation. So as we think about asymmetric information, we think about how law enforcement, by definition, has to control information and not be forthcoming and transparent with the investigative techniques and methods. Also, in more recent times, there have been a lot of concerns about power disparities, specifically with police brutality that's happened. And the asymmetric information not only disparages potential defendants and just the public in general, but also the police, because when these negative incidents happen in police brutality episodes, these get huge amounts of attention in the news media, across social media, and people aren't getting a balanced view of what exactly law enforcement organizations are doing. That's something that Professor Friedman's trying to address with his organization, is to foster dialogues, and he iterates in some of the videos, some of the interviews. If you check that out on YouTube, how police and his organization share in wanting to protect people and make sure that their children are safe, and to really execute the mission of law enforcement. At the same time, in modern times, there's a mandate there that stretches across so many different layers, where you're dealing with homeless people and addiction issues, and there's questions about, should that be a part of what police should have jurisdiction over, defining law enforcement's role. So there's a real limitation on the amount of information that's out there because of the nature of law enforcement, and also the hierarchy there in terms of the chain of command, where, yes, people at that upper level, there might be monopolies of knowledge where they have information which is not being shared with people on the front lines. And vice versa, people on the front lines might have access to information which isn't getting moved up the chain of command. So there's a lot of concerns on both sides and there's been a lot of distrust. I think that's pretty well known, that these incidents that have happened have led people to doubt the legitimacy of police. There have been movements to defund the police, and this is definitely something that's very relevant, because the criminal justice system depends upon information meaning evidence that someone's committed a crime. One of the articles that I've reviewed is actually making the case that asymmetric information is a good thing. For example, in protecting the rights of criminal defendants through requiring probable cause, for example. And if there's no probable cause, no matter what the evidence or information is relating to a crime, that evidence will be excluded. There was a discussion about what's called the Batson challenges, which is prosecutors, it's a Supreme Court decision, prosecutors cannot exclude jurors on the basis of race. And that was something that was geared for prosecutors, but the defendants and their attorneys did not have that same level of restriction. And this was a safeguard, along with other constitutional provisions, to account for the huge authority that the state has in literally taking away people's liberty, people's lives, if they're given a death penalty sentence, and to equalize, given the stakes involved and the risks involved, equalizing that field of power, really. And so asymmetric information can actually be a tool for leveling that power structure. But given recent events, it clearly isn't enough. And there have been a lot of changes since the Constitution was first written, and the Bill of Rights was ratified, but there's still a lot that needs to be done in modern times. And these are some of those things, some of the policy responses that can happen. There's, of course, constitutional protections, which are always being reevaluated by the Supreme Court and lower courts. You have offices of Inspector General, which offer oversight and also report on law enforcement activities. For example, Michael Horowitz is the Inspector General of the Department of Justice. He's issued reports about FBI operations, FBI misconduct complaints. So you have independent organizations that offer oversight and make more information available about what exactly law enforcement are doing. And the theory is that this will ultimately make them more efficient at executing their duties, and also hopefully in restoring some public trust. Social media and technology is given accountability to the general public, empowering them to document things. And these police brutality incidents that have happened, if we didn't have if we didn't have that camera footage, who's to say what exactly would have happened with George Floyd and so many others? You have whistleblower protection laws, like Serpico in the 70s went public about the NYPD and the corruption that was going on there. Community policing, which is a different law enforcement model where you have 8 officers working more closely with the community. Judicial proceedings as accountability, body cameras, information disclosure laws like FOIA, FOIPA, which is a federal information disclosure law, giving the public a right of access to law enforcement information, with some limitations as well, some exemptions from disclosure. And finally, there's some apps that Professor Friedman talks about, which can actually measure, give the public a chance to share their impressions of what's happening within law enforcement communities and how they're perceiving it. It kind of reminds me of Transparency International has what they call the Corruption Perception Index in evaluating countries around the world and people's perceptions of them and creating a rating system of sorts. So it seems like by turning the lens towards the public, there seems to be a movement to give a wider voice, not only in providing information to the public, but also seeing how the information is being received as well. So all of this could function in different ways to level the playing field and remedy the asymmetric information. And again, there was that one piece that I read that argues that asymmetric information in some contexts, particularly in leveling power disparities in favor of criminal defendants or those accused of crimes, could, and also to prevent police from overstepping their authority, that asymmetric information in that context should actually be maintained and perpetuated, because it actually furthers the aims of justice, the scales of justice, which is somewhat ironic that you have an imbalance which creates a balance when you think of justice and equity. So on that note, if you have any questions, please post them in the discussion forum. Look forward to reading those, and I'll be glad to respond. And I did review a number of articles and the reference pages here. So thanks for listening. Hope you learned something. And this is Jason Bounds wishing you a wonderful day. Thank you.